My name is Caitlin, and I'm 28 years old. Being forced to sit alone at my sister's wedding was the final insult after years of family rejection. I stared at the empty chairs surrounding me, fighting back tears as guests whispered. That's when he appeared, a handsome stranger with kind eyes who leaned in and said, "Act like you're with me." I had no idea those 6 words would ignite a chain reaction that would expose decades of family secrets and completely transform my life. Before I dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you've ever felt like the black sheep of your family. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends. Growing up in suburban Boston with my sister Heather, who's 2 years younger than me, was like living in a picture-perfect postcard that everyone could see, but only I could feel the sharp edges of. Our parents, Margaret and William, had a very specific vision of success, and Heather embodied it effortlessly. I, on the other hand, was the square peg they kept trying to hammer into a round hole. From the beginning, the differences between us were obvious. Heather was neat, organized, and naturally gifted at academics. I was creative, spontaneous, and struggled with the rigid structure of school despite being just as intelligent. My room was filled with art supplies and half-finished projects, while Heather's was immaculate, with trophies lined up perfectly on her shelves. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" became the soundtrack of my childhood. When I brought home a B+ in math, my parents barely acknowledged it because Heather had gotten straight A's that same semester. When I won second place in a state art competition, they missed the ceremony because they were attending Heather's debate tournament. One memory stands out painfully clear. I was 12 and had spent weeks creating a mixed media artwork for my parents' anniversary. I poured my heart into it, staying up late and getting up early to work on it in secret. When I presented it to them, my father glanced at it and said, "That's nice, Caitlin," before turning his full attention to the store-bought card Heather had given them. The artwork sat on a side table for a week before disappearing. I later found it in the garage, tucked behind some boxes. As we grew older, the divide only widened. Heather followed our parents' prescribed path perfectly: prestigious college, corporate job in finance, and then meeting James, the ideal fiancé from a well-connected family with an equally impressive career. I chose to study graphic design, a decision that was met with thinly veiled disappointment. "Art is a hobby, not a career," my father said when I showed him my college acceptance letter. My mother added, "You could still switch to business or law." I tried so hard to gain their approval. I dressed conservatively at family functions, took on freelance work with prestigious companies to prove my career was viable, and even dated men they would approve of, though those relationships never lasted because they weren't authentic to who I really was. At Heather's college graduation dinner, my parents gave her a car. At mine, they gave me a department store gift card. When Heather got her first apartment, they helped with the down payment. When I needed a loan for a new computer for my business, they suggested I budget better. Despite all of this, I maintained a relationship with my family. I told myself that family was family, and that someday they would see me for who I was and be proud. I showed up for holidays, sent thoughtful gifts, and tried to be interested in their lives even when they showed little interest in mine. So when Heather's wedding invitation arrived, despite knowing I wouldn't be welcomed warmly, I RSVP'd yes. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this happy occasion would be the moment our family could come together and heal. I believed in the possibility of change, even if experience had taught me otherwise. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, an elegant cream envelope with gold calligraphy that immediately announced its importance. I felt a flutter of excitement as I opened it. Despite our differences, Heather was still my sister, and I was happy for her. That feeling lasted until I noticed the wording: "We request the pleasure of Caitlin Walker's company." Not and guest. Just me. I stared at the invitation, turning it over as if a +1 might be hiding on the back. Nothing. I knew from family gossip that everyone else had received a +1, even cousins we barely spoke to. My aunt had mentioned bringing her new boyfriend. Even my mother's friend from book club was allowed to bring her husband. I called Heather that evening, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hey, I got your invitation today." "It's beautiful." "Thanks." "The calligrapher was amazing, right?" Well worth the cost. Absolutely. Just wanted to check if there was an oversight. My invitation doesn't include a +1. There was a pause before Heather responded, her voice cooler. No oversight. We're trying to keep numbers down. You're not seeing anyone serious anyway, right? Not at the moment, but... So it's fine then. Listen, I have to run. Cake tasting with James. Talk soon. The call ended before I could respond. I sat there holding my phone, that familiar feeling of exclusion washing over me again. This wasn't the first time. At Heather's engagement party 6 months earlier, I had arrived to find I was seated at a table in the corner with people I'd never met, some colleagues of James and a couple that had been invited as a professional courtesy to his boss. My parents and all other family members were seated at central tables. When I asked my mother about it, she smiled tightly and said, "The planner handled the seating arrangements." I'm sure it wasn't intentional. The next day, I met my best friend Rachel for lunch and brought the invitation with me. Am I overreacting? I asked, pushing the cream envelope across the table. Rachel read it and frowned. No, you're not. This is deliberate, Caitlin. They've been doing this to you for years, and it's not okay. Maybe I shouldn't go, I said, stirring my coffee absently. That's exactly what they want, Rachel said. They want you to either decline so they can say you're not supportive, or show up and feel miserable so they can say you're a downer. Don't give them either satisfaction. She was right. I decided then that I would go, but on my terms. I would show up looking amazing, keep my head high, and not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. The next weekend, Rachel and I went shopping. I spent more than I could afford on a dress that made me feel confident, a deep emerald green that complemented my auburn hair and made my eyes pop. I bought new shoes, had my hair trimmed, and even splurged on a professional makeup consultation so I could recreate the look on the big day. A week before the wedding, there was a pre-wedding dinner for family and the wedding party. I wasn't in the bridal party. Heather had chosen her college roommate, James's sister, and 2 cousins on our mother's side who had always been favored. I told myself it was fine. The dinner was at an upscale restaurant, and I arrived exactly on time, wearing a black cocktail dress that was elegant but not flashy. I didn't want to give anyone ammunition to say I was trying to steal attention. "Caitlin, you're at table 3, my mother said when I arrived, barely looking at me as she checked something off on her clipboard. She was in full event planner mode, despite the actual wedding having a professional coordinator. Table 3, it turned out, was in the restaurant's side room, separated from the main party. I was seated with an elderly great-aunt who was hard of hearing and a couple of James's relatives who spent the evening talking to each other. During the dinner, the photographer came around to take photos. She took several of my parents with Heather and James, then with the extended family. I stood up to join, but my mother waved me off. "We're doing immediate family first, then the wedding party. We'll do extended family later." Later never came. As I returned from the bathroom, I overheard Heather talking to one of her bridesmaids in the hallway. "Is your sister coming to the bachelorette this weekend?" the bridesmaid asked. "God, no," Heather laughed. "She's just too much drama. Besides, I don't think she'd fit in with everyone." I slipped back into the bathroom before they could see me, locked myself in a stall, and took deep breaths until I could compose myself. When I emerged, I plastered on a smile and returned to my table, where no one had noticed my absence. That night in my apartment, I seriously considered calling the whole thing off. I could claim illness, a work emergency, anything to avoid the further humiliation I knew was coming. But a larger part of me refused to be pushed away. This was my family, for better or worse. I would attend with dignity, even if I had to manufacture that dignity myself. The morning of Heather's wedding dawned sunny and perfect, because of course the universe would give her ideal weather. I woke up alone in my hotel room, one of the block of rooms reserved for out-of-town guests. I'd driven in from Boston the night before, despite only living an hour away, because I knew the day would start early and end late. As I sipped my room service coffee, I scrolled through Instagram. My feed was filled with photos of the bridal party getting ready together in the hotel's presidential suite, mimosas, matching robes, professional hair and makeup artists working their magic. Heather looked radiant, my mother proud. No one had thought to invite me to join, even just for a quick morning greeting. I took my time getting ready, carefully applying the makeup techniques I'd learned and styling my hair into soft waves. When I finally slipped into my emerald dress, I had to admit I looked good. Great, even. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and headed for the church. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 p.m., and I arrived at 1:30, wanting to be early but not awkwardly so. The church was already filling with guests. An usher I didn't recognize approached me with a smile. Bride's side or groom's? Bride's. I'm her sister. His smile faltered slightly. Oh, Mrs. Walker mentioned you. Right this way. I expected to be led to the front, where family typically sits. Instead, he guided me to a pew near the back, behind distant relatives and family friends. I looked around, confused. I think there's been a mistake. I'm the bride's sister, I repeated. The usher shifted uncomfortably. These are your assigned seats, ma'am. Direct instructions. I sat down, feeling eyes on me. A cousin I hadn't seen in years gave me a small, pitying smile from her seat near the front. I focused on the elaborate flower arrangements instead of the humiliation burning in my chest. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Heather was stunning in her designer gown, and even I couldn't deny that she and James looked completely in love. I felt a complex mixture of emotions, genuine happiness for my sister, pain at my obvious exclusion, and a deep sadness for the closeness we'd never had. After the ceremony, guests made their way to the reception venue, an elegant country club 10 minutes from the church. I drove myself, following the long line of cars. The cocktail hour was well underway by the time I navigated the receiving line, giving Heather a brief, appropriate hug and shaking James's hand. My parents, standing beside the couple, offered stiff greetings. My father barely made eye contact. You look beautiful, I told Heather sincerely. Thanks, she replied, already looking past me to the next guest. I moved into the main reception area, stopping at the seating chart display to find my table assignment. I scanned the elegant calligraphy once, twice, 3 times before I found my name. Table 19. I didn't immediately recognize any other names at the table. The main reception hall was beautifully decorated with cascading floral arrangements, twinkling lights, and cream and gold accents everywhere. Tables 1 through 15 were arranged around the dance floor, with the head table positioned at the front of the room. Tables 16 through 20 were in an adjoining area, partially separated by decorative screens. I made my way to table 19, which was positioned near the kitchen doors, far from the main action. As I approached, I realized something even worse than its location. It was completely empty. Not just temporarily empty, with other guests mingling during cocktail hour, but set for exactly one. One place setting, one chair, while all the other tables had 8 to 10 seats. I stood there frozen, staring at the single place setting with my name card propped against the water glass. A server emerged from the kitchen, saw me standing there, and gave me a look of such profound pity that I nearly burst into tears on the spot. Can I get you something to drink, miss? He asked kindly. White wine, please, I managed to say, my voice surprisingly steady. The largest you're allowed to pour. After he left, I sat down and tried to look nonchalant, as if being seated alone at my own sister's wedding was a choice I'd made rather than a deliberate humiliation orchestrated by my family. I watched as other guests found their tables, laughing and chatting. No one came to join me. During dinner, I spotted my mother making rounds, graciously checking on guests. When she approached my section, I thought for a moment she might come to my table, perhaps explain there had been a mistake. Instead, she skillfully avoided eye contact, speaking to everyone at the surrounding tables before slipping away when I stood up to approach her. Mom, I called, catching up to her near the cake table. Caitlin, I'm very busy right now, she said, her smile fixed and not reaching her eyes. The Andersons are waiting to speak with me, and I need to check on the timing for the speeches. I just wanted to ask about the table assignment, I persisted. There's been some mistake. No mistake, she said curtly. We had an odd number after some last-minute cancellations. Now, if you'll excuse me. She walked away, leaving me standing alone again. I made my way back to my solitary table, where my dinner had been served in my absence. As the evening progressed, a few relatives stopped by, making awkward conversation. "All alone over here?" my great-uncle Ted asked. "Where's your date?" I wasn't given a +1, I replied honestly. "Oh," he said, discomfort evident. "Well, that's too bad." Another relative, a cousin on my mother's side, was less tactful. "What did you do to get the exile table?" she asked, half joking but with genuine curiosity. "Existed," I replied with a forced smile. She laughed as if I'd made a joke and wandered away. The first dance came, with Heather and James swaying beautifully to their chosen song. Then the father-daughter dance was announced. I watched my father lead Heather onto the dance floor, his face full of pride. I remembered how he had missed my college graduation because of a critical work meeting, despite having known the date for months. I remembered every dance recital, art show, and milestone he had missed or dismissed over the years. When the general dancing started, I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment of privacy. I locked myself in a stall, finally allowing a few tears to escape. As I sat there trying to collect myself, the bathroom door opened and several women came in, bridesmaids, from the sound of their chatter. "Did you see Caitlin sitting by herself?" one asked. "That's so sad. Heather says she's always causing drama," another replied. "Apparently she's jealous or something. Still, a table for one? That's cold, even if she is difficult." Well, you know how Mrs. Walker is. Everything has to be perfect, and apparently Caitlin doesn't fit the family image. They continued talking as they touched up their makeup, unaware of my presence. Eventually they left, and I emerged from the stall, splashed cold water on my face, and repaired my makeup. I looked at myself in the mirror and made a decision. I would stay exactly 1 more hour. I would not give my family the satisfaction of seeing me slink away early, but I also wouldn't subject myself to this treatment all night. I returned to my empty table, now cleared of dinner dishes and set with a single slice of cake. The server had left me a generous pour of wine, another act of kindness from a stranger that nearly broke my composure. I sat down, prepared to endure my final hour of humiliation, when someone approached my table. "Is this seat taken?" a deep voice asked, startling me from my thoughts. I looked up to see a man standing beside my table, tall, with dark hair and kind eyes, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. I didn't recognize him from either side of the wedding party. "As you can see, all seats at this exclusive table are available," I replied with a gesture to the empty chairs, trying to mask my embarrassment with sarcasm. Instead of being put off, he smiled and pulled out the chair beside me. "I'm Mason," he said, offering his hand. "Caitlin," I replied, shaking it. "The bride's sister, if you can believe it." "I know," he said, surprising me. "I've been watching you sit here alone all evening, and I've been trying to work up the nerve to come over." "Are you a friend of James?" I asked, trying to place him. "Friend of his family, actually. I went to college with his brother." He leaned in slightly. "I also know what it's like to be the family misfit." Something in his tone made me believe him. There was a warmth and understanding in his eyes that I wasn't used to seeing when people looked at me. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "I have a proposition for you. Act like you're with me for the night, and we'll show them what they're missing. No one needs to know we just met." I stared at him, torn between suspicion and a desperate desire to accept his offer. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" "Because I've been in your shoes, and I had no one in my corner. Besides," he added with a grin, "you're easily the most interesting person here, and these events are usually boring as hell." I couldn't help but laugh. "You don't even know me." "I know enough. You chose that amazing emerald dress when every other woman here is in pastels or black. You've maintained perfect composure despite being seated alone at your sister's wedding. And you haven't left early, which shows backbone." I studied him for a moment, considering. What did I have to lose? My dignity was already in tatters. "Okay," I finally said. "What's our backstory?" "We met 6 months ago at a charity event. I work in architectural restoration, focusing on historical buildings. You were there because you donated artwork for the auction. We've been dating quietly because we both value our privacy." I raised an eyebrow, impressed. "You came up with that quickly." "I'm good at thinking on my feet," he said with a shrug. "Plus, I checked out your website earlier. Your design work is incredible. You Googled me. I wanted to know more about the woman sitting alone at table 19. For the first time that day, I felt a genuine smile form. Well then, Mason, would you like to dance? I thought you'd never ask. He led me onto the dance floor just as a slow song began. I was acutely aware of the stares as Mason placed his hand respectfully on my waist. From across the room, I could see my mother watching with unconcealed surprise. Heather, dancing with James, did a double-take when she spotted us. People are staring, I murmured. Good, Mason replied simply. Let them. He was an excellent dancer, leading confidently without being showy. As we moved around the floor, he kept up a stream of amusing commentary about the other guests, making me laugh genuinely for the first time that day. The woman in the purple fascinator has changed shoes 3 times, he whispered. She's got an entire shoe store in her oversized purse. When the song ended, he kept hold of my hand and led me to the bar, where he ordered drinks for both of us. As we waited, my mother appeared as if by magic, her social smile firmly in place. Caitlin, aren't you going to introduce me to your friend? She asked, her eyes assessing Mason from head to toe. Mother, this is Mason. Mason, this is Margaret Walker, mother of the bride. A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Walker, Mason said smoothly. You've done an amazing job with this wedding. And your daughters are both remarkable women. Caitlin was just telling me about her latest design project for that major tech company. So impressive. My mother blinked, clearly not expecting this. Yes, well, Caitlin has always been creative. She's brilliant, Mason corrected gently but firmly. Her portfolio demonstrates exceptional talent and vision. You must be incredibly proud. Of course, my mother said automatically, though I couldn't remember the last time she'd expressed any pride in my work. Well, I should check on the other guests. Nice to meet you, Mason. As she walked away, I turned to Mason in amazement. I've never seen her at a loss for words before. I just stated the obvious, he said with a shrug. Your work is brilliant. Throughout the evening, Mason stayed by my side. We danced, we talked, we laughed. He seamlessly integrated himself into conversations with relatives who suddenly found me much more interesting now that I had an attractive, successful man on my arm. When my father's brother made a pointed comment about real jobs versus hobbies, Mason smoothly interjected with statistics about the growth of the design industry and average salaries for top creative directors. The most surreal moment came when Heather herself approached us during a brief moment when James was occupied with his groomsmen. I didn't know you were seeing anyone, she said, her eyes fixed on Mason with obvious curiosity. There's a lot you don't know about me, Heather, I replied evenly. Mason, is it? How did you two meet? Mason slid his arm around my waist in a gesture that felt surprisingly natural. At a charity auction. Caitlin had donated some artwork that I absolutely had to have. How nice, Heather said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Will you be joining us for the family brunch tomorrow? Before I could respond, Mason said, we'd love to, but unfortunately we have plans. I'm taking Caitlin to see that exhibition she's been excited about in the city. There was no exhibition. There were no plans. But the way he created this bubble of protection around me, this alternate reality where I had value and importance, made something crack open inside my chest. When Heather left, I turned to Mason. Thank you, I said simply. For what? For making me feel like I matter. His expression softened. You do matter, Caitlin. With or without me here. As the evening wore on, I found myself genuinely enjoying the reception. Mason was easy to talk to, interested in my work and my life, and seemed to genuinely delight in helping me navigate the social minefield. We exchanged real information about ourselves between our fictional backstory. He really was an architectural preservationist, had a dog named Hugo, and loved old jazz records. I told him about my design business, my small apartment with the perfect light for houseplants, and my dream of traveling to Japan to study traditional art techniques. Just when I was starting to think this wedding might actually end on a positive note, the DJ announced the bouquet toss. I tried to hang back, but several aunts practically pushed me into the group of single women. When Heather turned around, she looked directly at me before tossing the bouquet in the opposite direction. It was caught by one of her bridesmaids, who squealed in delight. I made my way back to Mason, who had been watching from the sidelines. Subtle, he commented dryly. Subtlety has never been my family's strong suit, I replied. Except when it comes to their disapproval of me. That's always been crystal clear. Mason checked his watch. It's almost midnight. What do you say we get out of here? Unless you want to stay until the bitter end. I considered for a moment. I had accomplished what I'd set out to do. I'd attended with dignity intact. Now, leaving with this handsome stranger seemed infinitely more appealing than watching my sister and her new husband drive off amid a shower of rice and good wishes. Let's go, I decided. But let me say goodbye to Heather first. I'm not going to give them any ammunition to call me petty. Mason nodded. I'll get our coats. I found Heather in a quiet moment, touching up her lipstick near the bathroom. I'm heading out, I told her. Congratulations again. It was a beautiful wedding. She looked at me, then passed me toward Mason, who was waiting by the door. He seems nice. He is nice, I replied. Much nicer than being seated alone at a table by the kitchen deserved. A flicker of something, guilt? Defiance, crossed her face. That wasn't my decision. Mom did the seating chart. And you had no input? Just like you had no input on the +1 I didn't receive. I shook my head. It doesn't matter now. Be happy, Heather. I mean that sincerely. I turned to leave, but her voice stopped me. Caitlin. She seemed to struggle for words. Thanks for coming. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. I nodded and walked away, my head held high, toward Mason and the promise of a much better end to this evening than I could have possibly imagined. Mason and I had just retrieved our coats and were heading for the exit when I felt a hand on my arm. I turned to see Heather, her perfect makeup slightly smudged, her eyes bright with what might have been tears or anger. I need to speak with you, she said, her voice tight. Privately. Mason raised an eyebrow at me in silent question. I nodded reassuringly. I'll wait by the door, he said, squeezing my hand lightly before walking away. Heather led me into a small anteroom off the main hall, closed the door, and turned to face me, arms crossed. Who is he really? She demanded. I told you. His name is Mason. He's an architectural preservationist. And you just happened to bring him without telling anyone? After making such a big deal about not getting a +1. I stared at her, incredulous. Are you serious right now? I didn't bring him. He was already here, invited by James's family. We connected at the reception. Right, she scoffed. You just happened to meet a gorgeous, successful man who's completely into you, tonight of all nights. The implication hung in the air between us. That no man like Mason would be genuinely interested in me. That I must have orchestrated this to get attention. Why is that so hard to believe? I asked quietly. Because you always do this. Heather burst out. You always find a way to make things about you. You couldn't just let me have my day, could you? I felt like I'd been slapped. Make things about me? I've been invisible this entire wedding. I was seated alone at a table by the kitchen, Heather. Alone. That was Mom's idea, she said, but her eyes slid away from mine. And you didn't think to override that decision? To stand up for your sister? I shook my head, a realization dawning. Or was it actually your idea? Her silence was answer enough. Why? I asked, my voice cracking slightly. What did I ever do to deserve this kind of treatment from my own family? Heather's composure cracked. You don't fit, Caitlin. You never have. Mom and Dad were worried you'd make a scene or say something inappropriate or show up in some attention-grabbing outfit. They thought if we gave you a +1, you'd bring someone totally unsuitable. So instead you publicly humiliated me? Do you have any idea how that felt? It wasn't supposed to be public, she muttered. We thought you'd be upset and leave early. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. You wanted me to leave my own sister's wedding early because you were embarrassed by me. Not embarrassed exactly. Then what exactly? Heather couldn't meet my eyes. You're just so different. You always have been. You don't try to fit in with the family. You do your own thing regardless of what anyone thinks. Mom and Dad worry about how that reflects on them. And you? What do you worry about? I worry that when you're around, no one sees me, she admitted in a small voice. They're all focused on whatever drama you're causing or whatever unconventional thing you're doing. I laughed bitterly. Trust me, Heather, no one in this family has ever focused on me over you. Not once. Not ever. I moved toward the door. I'm done. Enjoy the rest of your perfect wedding. Caitlin, wait. But I was already out the door, tears threatening to spill. Mason took one look at my face and was immediately at my side. What happened? He asked, his hand gentle on my back. Family honesty hour, I said, trying to smile through tears. Can we just go, please? He nodded, guiding me out to the parking lot. The cool night air helped clear my head, but the conversation with Heather kept replaying. Years of feeling like an outsider in my own family, and now confirmation that it had been deliberate all along. Do you want to talk about it? Mason asked as we reached the parking area. Before I could answer, my father's voice called out from behind us. Caitlin. Leaving without saying goodbye. I turned to see him approaching, his bow tie loose, a champagne flute in his hand. He'd clearly been enjoying the open bar. I said goodbye to Heather, I replied evenly. I assumed that was sufficient. And you are? My father asked, looking Mason up and down with thinly veiled suspicion. Mason Calloway, he replied, extending his hand. Friend of the Evans family. My father ignored the outstretched hand. Well, Mason Calloway, I hope you've enjoyed our little celebration. It was a beautiful wedding, Mason said diplomatically. You must be very proud of both your daughters. My father's gaze flicked dismissively over me. Heather has always made us proud. Done everything right, that girl. The implication being that I had done everything wrong. The alcohol had loosened my father's typical restraint, allowing the disdain he usually kept carefully controlled to show plainly. Mason's posture straightened slightly. Actually, sir, Caitlin was just telling me about her design business. She's remarkably talented. My father waved his hand dismissively. Doodling on a computer isn't a real career. We always hoped she'd grow out of it and do something worthwhile. Dad, I warned, embarrassment and anger warring inside me. What? It's true, he continued. Your sister has a real job, a real life. What do you have? A tiny apartment full of art supplies and barely enough clients to pay rent. Mason stepped slightly in front of me. With all due respect, sir, you're wrong about your daughter. I've seen her portfolio, and her work is exceptional. Several of my colleagues in historical preservation have commissioned her for design work because she's that good. My father's face darkened. And who the hell are you to tell me about my daughter? Some random guy she picked up at the reception to make a statement. That's enough, I said firmly, finding my voice. We're leaving now. As we turned to go, my father called after us. This is exactly why we seated you alone, Caitlin. Always the drama, always the scene. I froze, then turned back slowly. No, Dad. There was no drama until you created it. There was no scene until you made one. I came to support Heather despite knowing how little you all think of me. I sat alone at that table and endured the whispers and stares. I didn't complain, didn't make a scene. I met someone kind who saw value in me that my own family never has. And now I'm leaving with my dignity intact, which is more than I can say for you right now. I turned on my heel and walked away, Mason beside me, leaving my father standing speechless in the parking lot. We reached my car, and I leaned against it, suddenly exhausted. I'm sorry you had to witness that, I said quietly. Don't apologize, Mason replied. You were magnificent. A watery laugh escaped me. Hardly. I'm a mess. A magnificent mess, then. He hesitated. Look, I know we just met, but would you like to get coffee somewhere? Talk? Or I could just make sure you get back to your hotel safely if you'd rather be alone. I considered for a moment. The thought of returning to my empty hotel room to replay the events of the night seemed unbearable. And there was something about Mason, something trustworthy and genuinely kind, that made me want to extend this strange evening. Coffee sounds good, I decided. But it's late. Everything's probably closed. The hotel where I'm staying has a 24-hour cafe in the lobby, he suggested. It's about 10 minutes from here. Lead the way, I said. I'll follow you. As we drove away from the venue, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of my mother standing with Heather at the entrance, watching us leave. Their expressions were unreadable from this distance, but for once, I found I didn't care what they were thinking. The night had been a disaster in many ways, but as I followed Mason's taillights through the quiet streets, I felt something unexpected: relief. The pretense was over. The family secrets were out in the open. And somehow, in the midst of it all, I'd found an unexpected ally. The hotel cafe was nearly empty at this late hour, just a few night owls tapping on laptops and a couple speaking in hushed tones in the corner. Mason and I found a quiet table away from the others, both ordering coffee despite the late hour. I'd long since kicked off my heels under the table, my feet sore from dancing and emotional confrontations. So, Mason said after our coffees arrived, that was quite a wedding. I laughed to spite myself. Not exactly the fairy tale my sister probably imagined. Want to talk about it? Or we could discuss literally anything else. I took a sip of my coffee, considering. Honestly, I think I need to process what happened. My family has always been difficult, but tonight everything came to a head. I know something about difficult families, Mason said, his expression understanding rather than pitying. My father hasn't spoken to me in 3 years because I refused to join the family law firm. That's why you said you knew what it was like to be the family misfit, I realized. He nodded. Black sheep solidarity. Though your family seems to take it to another level. Tonight was the culmination of years of subtle and not-so-subtle rejection, I admitted. But hearing Heather actually confirm they isolated me deliberately because they were embarrassed by me, that was new. For what it's worth, I spent most of the evening watching you before I worked up the nerve to approach your table. You handled yourself with incredible grace in an impossible situation. I was trying not to cry into my wedding cake, I confessed. Well, it worked. You looked like a queen holding court at a sadly empty palace. I smiled at that. Thank you for coming over. It changed the whole night for me. Best decision I've made in a long time, he said with a sincerity that made my cheeks warm. We talked for hours, long after our coffee cups were empty. Mason told me about growing up with the weight of family expectations, the disappointment when he chose architecture over law, the gradual rebuilding of his life on his own terms. I shared stories of my childhood, my struggle to build my design business, the small victories that kept me going despite my family's lack of support. The sky was beginning to lighten when we finally realized how late it had gotten. We exchanged phone numbers, and Mason walked me to my car. I'd like to see you again, he said. Under less dramatic circumstances. I'd like that too, I replied, surprising myself with how much I meant it. Back in my hotel room, I collapsed into bed, emotionally drained but with a strange sense of lightness. Something had broken open, and while it hurt, it also felt like the beginning of healing. I slept until nearly noon, waking to a flurry of notifications on my phone. 3 missed calls from my mother. A text from my father that simply read, "Your behavior was inappropriate." 2 messages from Heather, the first demanding to know if I'd left the reception with that man, the second, sent hours later, a surprising, "I'm sorry about last night." There was also a sweet good morning text from Mason, asking if I'd made it back to my hotel all right and hoping I'd gotten some rest. As I was trying to decide which messages deserved responses, my phone rang. It was Rachel. "Spill everything," she demanded when I answered. "I've been getting weird texts all morning about you causing a scene at the wedding with some mystery man." "I didn't cause any scene," I said, then proceeded to tell her everything: the solitary table, Mason's rescue, the confrontations with Heather, and my father. "Holy shit," Rachel breathed when I finished. I knew they were cold, but this is next level. "Are you okay?" Strangely, yes, I replied. It's like everything I've suspected for years has finally been confirmed. I'm not crazy. They really have been deliberately excluding me. I've been telling you that forever. I know, but part of me always hoped I was wrong. That maybe I was misinterpreting things or being too sensitive. And now? Now I know exactly where I stand. It's painful, but it's also clarifying. Rachel was quiet for a moment. What about this Mason guy? Is he for real? I think so, I said, feeling a small smile form. We talked until dawn. He gets it. He's been through something similar with his own family. Careful, Rachel warned. Trauma bonding can feel like a real connection, but it's not just that, I interrupted. He's kind and funny and interesting. And he stood up to my father, which basically makes him a superhero in my book. Rachel laughed. All right, I'll reserve judgment until I meet him. But I'm glad something good came out of that nightmare wedding. After hanging up, I forced myself to check the rest of my messages. There was a particularly disturbing one from an aunt who had witnessed part of the parking lot confrontation with my father, chastising me for embarrassing the family and suggesting I seek therapy for my obvious issues with authority. I was composing a polite but firm response when my phone buzzed with another call from a number I didn't recognize. "Hello," I answered cautiously. "Caitlin? It's Justine, Heather's friend from college. We met at the engagement party." I vaguely remembered her, one of the bridesmaids, blonde and petite. "Yes, hi. What can I do for you?" This is awkward, but I thought you should know. Your family has been saying things about you, for years actually, and after what I saw last night, I don't think it's right." My heart rate picked up. "What kind of things?" "That you're unstable. Attention-seeking. That you have episodes." She paused. "Heather told everyone you weren't in the wedding party because you're unreliable and might have a breakdown during the ceremony." I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "That's not true. Any of it." "I know," she said softly. "I've met you several times, and you've always seemed perfectly normal to me. And last night, the way they treated you. I was at table 18, right next to you. I saw you sitting there alone. No one with a shred of decency would do that to family." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because it's wrong," she said simply. "And because I've watched Heather spread these stories about you for years, and I've said nothing. I'm not proud of that." After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence. The betrayal cut deep, not just the seating arrangement or the confrontation, but years of my sister actively damaging my reputation within our social circle, my parents allowing and probably encouraging it. I made a decision then. I texted Mason to confirm our dinner plans for the following weekend, then sent brief messages to my mother and Heather stating that I needed space and would be in touch when I was ready. I blocked my father's number entirely. The drive home felt symbolic somehow. With each mile I put between myself and the wedding venue, I felt myself breathing more freely. For the first time, I was choosing myself over the futile quest for my family's approval. It hurt, but it also felt right. 2 days later, Heather called from her honeymoon. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. "Caitlin," she said, sounding tired. "I got your text." I meant what I said. "I need space." "I know." She paused. I'm sorry about your seating assignment. It was mean. It was probably the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get from her, but it wasn't enough. "It wasn't just mean, Heather. It was cruel. And according to your friend Justine, it's just the tip of the iceberg of what you've been doing." Her sharp intake of breath told me Justine had been telling the truth. She had no right. She had every right. I cut in. "You've been telling people I'm mentally unstable? That I have episodes? How could you do that to your own sister?" "You don't understand," Heather said, her voice taking on the familiar defensive tone. "Mom and Dad always made such a big deal about how special and creative you were. How I should be more understanding because you're sensitive. Do you have any idea what it's like growing up with a sister who gets all the attention for being difficult while you're ignored for doing everything right?" I was speechless for a moment. "Is that really how you see it?" "Heather, they've always preferred you. Always. You were the golden child who could do no wrong. I was the disappointment they could barely tolerate." "That's not true," she insisted, but with less conviction. "They gave you a car for graduation. I got a gift card. Because I had better grades. They helped you buy your first apartment. They told me to budget better when my computer died and I needed it for work. That's because they trust my financial decisions. They seated me alone at your wedding, Heather. Alone. At a table by the kitchen. How do you explain that as anything other than deliberate cruelty?" She was silent for so long I thought she might have hung up. Finally, she spoke in a small voice. "They said if we seated you with other guests, you might say something to embarrass us. That it was safer to keep you separated." The truth finally laid bare was both devastating and liberating. "And you believed them?" "I didn't know what to believe," she admitted. "They've been telling me versions of that story our whole lives. That you're too sensitive, too dramatic, too different. That I need to be the responsible one because you can't be counted on." I thought about all the times I'd tried to connect with my sister over the years, all the rebuffs and rejections. Did it ever occur to you they might be wrong? Another long pause. Maybe. Sometimes. I don't know, Caitlin. This is all I've ever known. We talked for almost an hour, beginning to untangle the web of manipulation and favoritism that had shaped our relationship since childhood. It wasn't a full reconciliation. Too much damage had been done for that, but it was a start. A tiny crack in the foundation of lies our family was built upon. In the weeks that followed, I limited contact with my parents to brief, factual text messages. I started seeing a therapist to help process the years of emotional neglect. And I began dating Mason, our connection deepening with each dinner, museum visit, and late-night phone call. As painful as the wedding had been, it had forced a reckoning that was long overdue. The family myths had been exposed, and in their place, I was slowly building a life based on truth and, for the first time, genuine acceptance. Thanksgiving arrived with a blanket of early snow and the usual dread I felt before family gatherings. In the 2 months since Heather's wedding, I'd maintained minimal contact with my parents and had a few cautious conversations with my sister. The wedding incident had opened a door that couldn't be closed again, forcing us all to acknowledge the dysfunctional patterns we'd been perpetuating for years. I hadn't planned to attend Thanksgiving at my parents' house, but Heather had called repeatedly, insisting that things would be different, that my parents were trying to understand. Against my better judgment and my therapist's gentle warnings, I agreed to go. Mason offered to come with me, a buffer and support system in what was sure to be a tense situation. "You don't have to do this," he reminded me as we drove to my parents' suburban home, Christmas music playing softly on the radio despite it still being November. "I know," I replied, watching familiar landmarks pass outside the window. "But I think I need to. One last chance to see if anything can change." The house looked the same as always, perfectly maintained colonial with tasteful holiday decorations. No excess, nothing that might make the neighbors raise an eyebrow. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. My mother answered the door, her smile tight as she took in Mason beside me. "Caitlin." And Mason, was it? How nice. The temperature inside dropped several degrees despite the roaring fireplace as we entered the living room. My father stood by the mantel, drink in hand, offering a curt nod in place of a greeting. Heather and James sat on the sofa, looking uncomfortable but attempting smiles. "Caitlin," Heather said, rising to give me a brief, awkward hug. "And Mason. Thanks for coming." Mason shook hands with James, the two men exchanging pleasantries about the early snow and holiday traffic. My father remained by the fireplace, watching silently. "Can I get you something to drink?" My mother asked, already moving toward the kitchen, eager for something to do. "Water is fine, thank you," I replied. Mason asked for the same. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. I caught Heather's eye, and she gave me a small, encouraging nod. We'd spoken several times since our post-wedding conversation, and while things were still fragile between us, there had been moments of genuine connection. Dinner was a stilted affair. My mother had prepared her usual elaborate spread, and conversation remained carefully superficial. James's work promotion, Heather's plans to redecorate their new house, a cousin's engagement. I noticed my mother directed most questions to Mason, perhaps finding it easier to engage with him than address the elephant in the room. "So Mason," she said as she served pumpkin pie, "Caitlin tells us you work in architectural preservation." "That sounds fascinating." "It is," he replied warmly. "I'm currently working on restoring a 19th century theater downtown. The craftsmanship from that era is remarkable." "And you met at the wedding?" my father asked, his first direct question of the evening. "Yes, sir," Mason answered. It was fortunate for me that Caitlin was seated alone, or I might not have had the courage to approach her. The table went silent. My mother's serving spoon hovered in midair. "Mason," I said quietly, placing a hand on his arm. "No, it's all right," he replied, his eyes on my father. "We don't need to pretend." My father set down his fork with deliberate precision. "Young man, I don't think you understand the dynamics of our family." "I understand more than you might think, sir," Mason replied evenly. "I understand that Caitlin has been made to feel like an outsider in her own family for years. I understand that at her sister's wedding, she was deliberately isolated in a way that was meant to humiliate her. That's enough, my father said sharply. Is it? I asked, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. I think we're just getting started. My mother's face had gone pale. This is not an appropriate dinner conversation. When is it appropriate, Mom? I asked. When have you ever been willing to talk about how this family actually functions? About why I've always been treated like a problem to be managed rather than a daughter to be loved. That's not true, she protested. We've always loved you, Caitlin. In your way, maybe, I acknowledged. But your love has always been conditional. I had to fit your image of what a daughter should be, and when I couldn't or wouldn't, I was pushed aside. You've always been difficult, my father said. From the time you were a child. Everything was a battle with you. Because I had opinions? Because I wanted to make art instead of study law? Because I didn't fit the perfect family picture you were trying to create? We wanted what was best for you, my mother insisted. No, I replied, the clarity of years of therapy behind me. You wanted what was easiest for you. What made you look good to your friends? What fit your narrative? Heather, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. She's right, Mom. You and Dad always made Caitlin feel like she wasn't good enough. You did it to me too, just differently. My parents stared at her in shock. This was a new development. Heather had never openly sided with me against them. What are you talking about? My mother demanded. We've supported everything you've ever done. Because I did exactly what you wanted, Heather replied. I was so afraid of being treated like Caitlin that I became the person you wanted me to be instead of figuring out who I really was. My father's face darkened with anger. This is ridiculous. We've given both of you everything. Education, opportunities, support. And this is the thanks we get? Material support isn't the same as emotional support, Dad, I said quietly. Yes, you paid for my college. But you've never once told me you're proud of me. You've never shown genuine interest in my work or my life. You've never made me feel like I belong in this family. That's not fair, my mother protested, tears welling in her eyes. We've tried so hard with you, Caitlin. Have you? Mason asked, his voice gentle but firm. From what I've seen and heard, you've spent more time trying to change Caitlin than trying to understand her. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I don't need to be lectured in my own home by some man my daughter barely knows. Dad, Heather interjected, please sit down. We need to talk about this. To my surprise, he did sit, though his jaw remained clenched in anger. I didn't come here to fight, I said, taking a deep breath. I came hoping that maybe, after everything that happened at the wedding, we could start to be honest with each other. That maybe you could really see me for once. What do you want from us, Caitlin? My mother asked, her voice small. Acknowledgement, I replied simply. Acknowledgement that the way you've treated me has been hurtful. That seating me alone at Heather's wedding was cruel and deliberate. That the stories you've spread about me being unstable or difficult were unfair and untrue. My parents exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. My father spoke first, his voice tight. We did what we thought was best. If you were hurt by our decisions, that wasn't our intention. It wasn't an apology, just a deflection of responsibility. I nodded, having expected nothing more. I think we should go, I said to Mason, who immediately nodded his support. Caitlin, don't, Heather pleaded. We're finally talking about this. No, we're not, I replied sadly. They're still not willing to acknowledge what they've done. And until they can, there's no path forward for us. I stood, Mason following suit. Thank you for dinner. Happy Thanksgiving. My mother began to cry, the tears I'd seen her use so effectively over the years to redirect attention and sympathy away from the actual issue at hand. My father remained stonily silent, his disapproval radiating from every pore. Only Heather followed us to the door. I'm sorry, she whispered, hugging me briefly. I really thought they might listen this time. It's not your fault, I told her. This is who they are. But you and I, we can choose to be different. She nodded, wiping away a tear. Call me tomorrow. I will, I promised. The drive home was quiet, both of us processing the evening. Mason reached over and took my hand, a silent gesture of support that meant more than words could express. Are you okay? He finally asked as we neared the city. Yes, I realized, somewhat surprised to find it was true. I think I needed that. Needed to see that they're still not capable of the honesty and accountability I deserve. What now? Now I stopped waiting for them to change, I said, a weight lifting as I spoke the words aloud. I build a life that makes me happy, with people who see and value me for who I actually am. I squeezed his hand, and he smiled over at me before returning his eyes to the snowy road ahead. When Christmas invitations came 3 weeks later, I declined politely but firmly. Instead, Mason and I booked a trip to Montreal, spending the holiday exploring a snow-covered city where no one knew us or had any expectations of who we should be. It was the most peaceful Christmas I'd had in years. Spring arrived with a burst of renewal that mirrored my own internal transformation. 6 months after the wedding that had changed everything, I was sitting in my therapist's office for our weekly session, reflecting on how far I'd come. I barely recognized myself in old journal entries I found last week. I told Dr. Bennett, a kind-eyed woman who had guided me through the painful process of setting boundaries with my family. I was so desperate for their approval, so convinced that if I just found the right words or actions, they'd finally see me. And now, she prompted. Now I know that their inability to accept me was never about me at all. It was about their own rigid expectations and fears. I can't change that, and I don't need to try anymore. Dr. Bennett smiled. That's significant progress, Caitlin. How has the reduced contact been working for you? After the Thanksgiving disaster, I had limited communication with my parents to occasional text messages and declined all invitations for in-person visits. With Heather, things were more complex. We spoke every couple of weeks, our conversations tentative but increasingly honest. It's been peaceful, I admitted. I still feel sad sometimes, especially around family events I've chosen to miss. But the constant anxiety, the feeling that I'm walking on eggshells, that's gone. And your relationship with Mason. I couldn't help the smile that spread across my face. It's good. Really good. He's patient with all of this. Understanding. Because of his own family history, Dr. Bennett observed. Partly I agreed. But also because that's who he is. He sees me, the real me, and he values that person. It's still strange sometimes, being accepted so completely. As I left the session, I thought about how much had changed since that solitary table at Heather's wedding. My design business was thriving. I had taken the risk of raising my rates and focusing on clients who truly appreciated my work, and surprisingly, my client list had grown rather than shrunk. I'd moved from my tiny apartment to a slightly larger one with better light for my plants and a small second bedroom I'd converted into a proper home office. Most significantly, I'd built a circle of genuine connection around me. Rachel remained my steadfast best friend. Mason had introduced me to his circle of friends, who had welcomed me warmly. I'd even reconnected with several old friends from college who had drifted away during the years I'd spent trying to conform to my family's expectations. That evening, Mason and I were preparing dinner together in my kitchen when my phone rang. Heather's name flashed on the screen. "Do you mind if I take this?" I asked Mason, who was chopping vegetables. "Of course not," he replied, gesturing toward the living room with the knife. "Take your time." "Heather," I answered, settling onto the couch. "Everything okay?" "Not really," she replied, her voice tight. "James and I have been fighting. A lot." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, genuinely concerned. "What's going on?" "It's stupid," she began, then sighed. "No, it's not stupid. It's important. He wants me to quit my job and focus on starting a family, just like Mom did. He says my career is optional since he makes enough for both of us. And you don't want that." "I don't know what I want," she admitted, frustration evident in her voice. "That's the problem. I've spent so long doing what everyone else expected that I don't know what I actually want for myself." The irony wasn't lost on me. "That sounds familiar." "I know," she said softly. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately. About how you always knew who you were, even when everyone was telling you to be someone else. I envied that, even while I was judging you for it." I let that sink in. "It wasn't easy, Heather." "It's still not easy. But it's real," she replied. "Your life is authentically yours. Mine feels like a script someone else wrote." We talked for almost an hour, diving deeper than we had in years. Heather confessed that she'd known about the solitary table assignment weeks before the wedding, but had been too afraid of our parents' disapproval to object. She apologized again, more sincerely this time, without qualifications or deflections. "I need to tell you something else," she said, her voice hesitant. "About Mom and Dad." I tensed, bracing myself. "What about them?" "They weren't just embarrassed by you being different. They were afraid." "Afraid? Of what?" "Of people finding out about Mom's sister. Your Aunt Catherine." I frowned, trying to recall. "Mom doesn't have a sister named Catherine." "Exactly," Heather replied meaningfully. "No one talks about her because she was the family embarrassment, creative, unconventional, refused to follow Grandpa's rules. She was cut off from the family before we were born. You remind them of her, especially Mom." I sat in stunned silence, processing this revelation. "How long have you known this?" "Since high school. I overheard Grandma talking about her once after she'd had too much wine. When I asked Mom about it later, she made me promise never to mention Catherine again. Said she'd made her choices and wasn't part of the family anymore." "So there's a whole history of rejecting people who don't conform," I said slowly. "A family pattern." "Exactly. And I think they saw those same qualities in you from when you were little, and it terrified them. They thought if they could just squash that part of you early enough, they could avoid another Catherine situation." After the call ended, I sat motionless on the couch, trying to absorb this new information. Mason came in from the kitchen, concern etched on his face. "Everything okay?" he asked, sitting beside me. I relayed Heather's revelation about our aunt, the family secret that explained so much about my childhood experiences. "It doesn't excuse how they treated you," Mason said gently. "But it does help explain it." "It's like I've been fighting against a ghost I didn't even know existed," I replied. "All these years, trying to understand why they couldn't accept me, and it wasn't even really about me at all." Over the next few weeks, I did some digging of my own, reaching out to distant relatives and piecing together the story of Catherine Walker, my mother's older sister who had been effectively erased from the family narrative. Through a second cousin, I even found a photograph, a young woman with my eyes and smile, dressed in bohemian clothes, painting at an easel. The resemblance was startling, not just physically, but in the spark of life evident even in the faded photograph. I had it framed and placed it on my desk, a reminder that I wasn't the first to forge my own path and that the price of authenticity had been paid before. As the one-year anniversary of Heather's wedding approached, Mason planned a special evening to mark what he called the luckiest table assignment of my life. He took me to an elegant restaurant overlooking the city, the kind of place where candlelight flickers on white tablecloths and the waitstaff appears and disappears with perfect timing. "I have something for you," he said after dessert, reaching into his jacket pocket. It wasn't a ring box as I had half expected, and I realized with some surprise, half hoped for, but a small wrapped package. Inside was an antique compass, beautifully preserved and still functional. "What's this for?" I asked, turning it over in my hands. "It's a reminder," he said, taking my free hand across the table. "A year ago, you were at a crossroads. You could have continued trying to follow someone else's map for your life, or you could start navigating by your own internal compass. You chose the harder path, the authentic one." Tears pricked at my eyes. "It's the most beautiful gift anyone's ever given me." "There's an inscription on the back," he said softly. I turned the compass over to read the delicately engraved words, "The only journey worth taking is your own." That night, as we walked along the river near my apartment, I reflected on the extraordinary year behind me. From the humiliation of that solitary table to this moment of profound connection and self-acceptance, it had been a journey of painful revelations and unexpected joy. My relationship with my family remained complicated. Heather and I were rebuilding on new, more honest terms. My parents had made a few tentative overtures, though still without the acknowledgement or apology I needed. I remained open to the possibility of reconciliation, but no longer tied my sense of worth to their approval. Instead, I had built my own chosen family of friends and loved ones who valued me for exactly who I was. My business was thriving precisely because I'd stopped trying to please everyone and focused on the work that truly inspired me. And in Mason, I'd found a partner who saw both my strengths and vulnerabilities and cherished them equally. The wedding that was meant to diminish me had instead become the catalyst for the most authentic chapter of my life. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most painful packages. Sometimes being forced to sit alone at a table becomes the first step toward finding your rightful place in the world. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family or struggled to be seen for who you truly are, I hope my story gives you courage. The path to authenticity isn't easy, but it's infinitely worthwhile. Let me know in the comments if you've had a similar experience or if something in my story resonated with you. And if you found value in what I've shared today, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. Remember, you deserve to be accepted exactly as you are, and sometimes the family that truly sees you is the one you build for yourself. Thank you for listening, and I wish you the courage to follow your own compass, wherever it may lead.